Welcome to the show to everybody today. The Royal Oak Historical Centre today has invited back one of our previous guests, and his name is Norrie Spencer. Now, there's two brothers, Don and Norrie. Don is in the crowd. They did a presentation about 3 months ago, but we didn't have time to finish. And there was, as I said in the presentation in the beginning, I could not believe the amount of material the Spencer family has put together and retained. Now, you can find anything about the family and everything else in their house somewhere. It's in a box or a bag. And of course, Norrie did the cross-country tour. The family originated from Alberni or Port Alberni, and I'd just like Norrie to kind of take it from there and explain a little bit about the beginnings of the Spencers and how they arrived in Canada. It's all yours.
Okay. Alec William Spencer came to Vancouver Island in 1891 for this first trip. He walked from Victoria to Alberni in 3 days. So I don't know what the route was, that's questionable. And then he had to go back a year later to marry his sweetheart, Jenny Spencer. Jenny was not allowed to have a wedding until she was 21. English rules, I guess, I don't know. So they came back out here, and when he was here the first time, he built a little cabin up on Beaver Creek, and then they came back. He bought or got a land grant from the federal government for a farm out in McCoy Lake area. So that's halfway to Sproat Lake from Alberni. So they were there and farmed from 1894 until the year 1900. In 1900, Alberni Valley had a great big freeze up, worse than we had just a couple of weeks ago here. And so they had to move it back into Alberni because they couldn't get any water because everything was frozen up. And then they, at that time, bought another piece of property in Alberni. So I guess they just gave the other piece back to the government. So then they built a farm in Alberni. And as far as I know, that farm was still in Spencer name until about, I'd say 1946 or 47, when my grandmother moved down to Victoria. I was talking to somebody just yesterday from the church that she went to here, and he said he could remember her coming to church driving her Model A. Now, up on the board here, I've got a thing about her getting her driver's license when she was 70. Never nobody bothered with driver's license because there weren't many cars around. And so she got this in 1970. She drove a Model A. And there's another little card here that's hers too. It came out in 1940, and that was to apply to federal government to get your coupons for gas and food and all that stuff during the war. So that's kept, and it's still right there. Okay, so where do we go from there, Gary?
Okay, your dad was born in the second cabin, correct?
Well, he was born in the farm.
On the farm.
They had
okay.
a farm.
Alwyn, yes.
Alwyn, my dad was the fourth brother of four. My uncle Norrie, my uncle Jeff, my uncle Brian, and then my dad.
Explain a little bit about your uncle that, I guess this is later on when you bought all the clothing from the Navy.
Oh, okay, yeah, that was my uncle Norrie, who I'm named after. And Uncle Norrie was in the end of the Second World War. Actually, he just got in right at the end of it. So how old I think he was born around just before 1900. Yeah. So he got in the war, and he was in the Army. And somehow he came across, when the war ended, they had all these uniforms for the Army people. And he was able to get them. Whether he paid anything for them, we don't know. But he went down to California with all these uniforms and set up a costume business in North Hollywood. So my Uncle Norrie, and he had a daughter, Dorothy, and a son, Doan. And there's a couple of pictures of them here and some of their attributes.
Maybe, Norrie, before you get to your father and meeting your mother, Violet, explain a little bit about Dome, I think, because that's on that far side of it. Okay,
well, Doan's T-birds are here, and that's an iconic T-bird. It's in the museum, the Peterson Museum in LA today. And I don't think I have a picture of on here. I didn't put one on, of the sunbeam tigers he built. He built a whole flock of sunbeam tigers. Most people thought they just came out of the factory, but Doane had his factory. He had 5 engineers and machinists working on parts for them. They shipped some of them to England and built the others right in the LA sunbeam tigers. So a sunbeam tiger is a sports car with a Ford engine in it. So for those people.
He was world famous because he designed all kinds of cars, and people had no idea that he was able to do all this, but he did. But that's kind of coming up a bit more to the present. But your father being born in the second log cabin,
Yeah.
you know, how and when did you meet your mother? Do you remember?
Well, my mother's family were from Saskatchewan, Elstow, and they got burned out about 1912 or 13 when my mother was 1 or 2 years of age. They came to Port Alberni, and they bought sort of a farm. They always called it the ranch when we were kids. And that's just before you take the bridge going out of Alberni, going to Sprout Lake, up on that ridge by where the cemetery is now. And so they met in high school. My mom came down to nursing in Victoria in probably 1929 or somewhere around there, 30. And she didn't make her nursing training. She contacted TB in those days as a nurse. But so she had to quit that. And then, so she went back and married my dad. And that was in 1934. And that leads us into, well, just before we get to that, the reason for the camper. And they built this camper for their honeymoon. But up in the area up in here, there's the old Alberni house right there. But these pictures, there was about 10 or 20 families, depending on the year, that used to go down to Hand Island, and that's down by Ucluelet, down the Alberni Canal, and they would camp there. And they would camp there all summer. These families from Alberni, the husbands would go back by boats, and there's a boat in the background there, and they would go back to work up in Alberni on the week and come down on the weekends. So camping was in their blood. So this was the reason my dad started building this camper in 1933. They left Alberni in 1934. May the 10th was the wedding, so it'll be a day or two after that. And I want to show you, so the camper, I'm just going to show you the route, and then we'll maybe talk about the camper in a minute. The route that they traveled started, of course, in Alberni, where the blue tag is here. They went to visit some relative. Do you remember who that was, Don? Over by Powell River. And I didn't know it, but I found this old map that says 1931. And probably one of the maps they used. And there was a ferry from Campbell River and Comox over to Powell River area. And another interesting part of that area, whether it was coincidence or not, I don't know, but that piece of highway up there, Powell River to Lund, is 101. And that's the end of 101 in Canada. Because later on, they came back 101 up the coast from California. So that's significant. So they left Powell River, and there was boats and stuff down into Vancouver. They went up the Fraser Canyon, and they had some issues on Jackass Mountain, I think. They got as far as where this green peg is, Lac La Hache. Then they had to get 2 teams of horses to pull them out of the mud. There was a big rainstorm through that up there, and they had 2 teams of horses to pull them out of the mud. So and they didn't get to Prince George. They turned around, went to the Okanagan, down 97, and all the way down to Bend, Oregon, where my mother had an uncle, and that was on her side of the family. So they visited in Bend, Oregon. Then they went further south of that, and they took this camper, as we'll talk about in a second, all the way up to Crater National Park. I've got a little book on Crater National Park of the time here, if some of you want to have a look at it. So they took the camper way up on the top of the hill, up Crater Lake, which is basically another thing like Lake Shasta, volcanic area. Then they left there, went down. I'm not sure how they got down the coast, but they went as far as the Redwoods. They might have gone into Hollywood because they had relatives there. I don't know anything of that story You, Don? And so then they came up, we have pictures of them at the Redwoods. They came up the coast and they landed in Port Angeles, and they had a hard time getting enough money to get across the ferry to Victoria. That was 1934, the end of the Depression. And so nobody had money, there was no banks, there was nothing. We think we're getting into tough times now, but they were tough times in those days. And so they got across to Victoria here at Labor Day weekend, and they bought a house or property within the next few months. And the property there is on Piedmont. Most of you know Piedmont, running up from the highway just south of where the boats are on the Elk Lake there. And they had a piece of property from the highway all the way up to Santa Clara on the south side of Piedmont. Okay, there are some shots of the old farm in Alberni here next to the camper. And this is going Cathedral Grove, and there's where the rock blew off there in the 50s, 60s into Cameron Lake. Okay, now this camper, and you can see the structure of it underneath here, that it was built pretty heavy on a Model T 1927 truck, so, or a car, basically. So these are all timbers that Dad did, and this is my mom there in the framework, and here's a shot of it sort of finished. That piece of wood right there, by the way, is one of these pieces here. So the V-joint wood, and it was fir. When we come to mine, it's mostly cedar. So, and there's the last of that camper that I can remember was up the house, at this house in top of Piedmont. They moved up from south of Piedmont up to Santa Clara in Piedmont, right at the top of the hill there. So that's the house, and behind the house was this little shed. This shed here we lived in while they were building. It was started during the war, 1943 or 44, the house. Dad had to get permits from Ottawa because of the war effort, and you couldn't get nails. Any box like a keg of nails coming into town. We had a friend down the road, Mr. Rawlinson, worked in Eaton's, or it was Spencer's at that time, and he would save a keg of nails for us every time he could get hold of some horse. And so that was built during the war, and you could only build 1,000 square feet, so lots of parts of the house hang over, and so get a bit more square footage. So trying to get the lumber and trying to get other things, we had this little shed. We lived in that for about a year. Dawn and I were up on the top. We had to climb a ladder to get up to our bed, and so we lived in there, and it eventually became our chicken house. And there's the last of the camper that I can remember right there, because when we'd have some guests in or something, they had to go sleep in the camper. So that's some of the story about the camper. So it went all those roads. When we got, I mentioned the team of horses up there, they had a few other incidents along the way with that camper, but they eventually arrived in Victoria. So we do the questions after. Okay, so we'll move on from there.
What kind of a stove, or what was there?
It was a wood-burning cast iron stove, and where's the picture of the chimney? Right there. And another little story, you see these little boxes on here with the white markers on? They were put on after he originally built it, when it was not shown in any of the other pictures. He took the thing out for a first test run, went down the Alberni Mountain, or over and down the mountain. He hardly had to touch his brakes because that flat back, without those boxes on, just held him back. So then he had to put these on, so he cut down the wind resistance. So aerodynamics are in everybody's mind. And this little one here, you can come and look at these after, is the registration for this thing, and it was registered to Alvin R. Spencer, Box 6 in Alberni. Still had that on there, but this was 1935. Ford touring camper, 2410 weight. So I don't know where they got the weight. Okay, so that was their wedding pictures. There's my grandmother there. So any more stories there, Gary, from that board?
That top paper, Norrie? Right? No, yeah, right there.
Oh, this is Alec walking in Alberni. Okay, I covered that.
Fine. All right.
Covered that. See if people can read that.
Okay, let's go to the...
Okay, yeah, well, the first electric start Model A, and we're dealing with cars all the time here, went into Alberni, and that was their car in 1919. And then they bought their next Model A, was the first four-door Model A in 1928. Now, I'm not sure whether that's what my grandmother still had here down in Victoria after the war. But she had a Model A, so hopefully it's the same one. Okay, you want to break?
You want to go to the cross-country tour?
Okay.
Canada tour now?
So that's the background of why we built a camper. We had it in our blood, but I can remember being in Saskatchewan with a tent trailer behind a Pinto, and it was bogging down going up through the southern part of BC, towing this camper. We'd gone back to visit another one of our school chums here, John Green. And then we had Fred here last month. Well, John has passed away now, but John was the dentist, and he'd gone back to Saskatchewan back in that time. I'm not sure what year that was, but it would probably be about 1970. And he went there to set up dental care for the whole of Saskatchewan as it being a dentist. And of course, John's no longer with us. Fred's still here. His sister's passed away too. So, okay.
How did you get into the Cross Canada tour? Was it just, how did that start?
Okay, cross Canada. Okay, I had a sheet of paper here somewhere on it. But in 2 years, just less than 2 years before we started in 1980, go across Canada, a group of people from the Maple Ridge chapter of the Vintage Car Club got together, sent a letter, or they got some preliminary work done first, sent a letter to our BC government at the time, and they got good reception back. What they planned to do was to have a trip from Victoria to Newfoundland. Newfoundland was always complaining, but none of the vintage cars ever came over to Newfoundland, mainly because of the cost of the ferries. So this trip was to handshake from Pacific Coast to Atlantic Coast, across Canada from one end to the other. And that was, we took this to the provincial government, or I wasn't even on the committee or anything. I came on about a year later, you know, before 1980. But they went after the government, and this jacket, government paid for that, and we had to buy the pants, but they paid for this, and this was one of our sponsors, Turbo, and then we had Red Ram Oil, and so on. If we were doing it today, it would be pretty pricey. We had free gas until we got to Winnipeg. Our vouchers ran out on our thing. So it was a lot of sponsors. My wife, we sent a few letters out to people. And my wife got one letter back, and we ended up with, I think, about 5 or 6 cases of Weetabix cereal. And we handed that out to all the cars going on the ferry going over. So we had quite a send-off from Victoria here. Murray Gammon was involved with his hotel, and Murray Gammon did some sponsor work for us. But we had the provincial government people like Grace McCarthy, and then there was Alana Poppin. She was something to do with it too. Grace McCarthy. So they all sent us off from mile 0 down here from Victoria to go across Canada. It was 49.80 is a milepost in St. John's, the other end of it. So that's how far it is, and you do some back roads and other roads, so your mileage is more than that. And our truck, when we bought it and got it ready to go, it had less than 30,000 miles on it. It had been a farm truck. And we've got a history of the farm truck. We're the 3rd owners, and it's always been a farm truck, that truck that we used to build on here. And so, and there's the end of the trip, Signal Hill. And there's the Signal Hill, there's our truck in the back there. And this is the ferry we took to go back to the mainland to come back. And these cars, we were all lined up there waiting to get our undercarriage sprayed with water to take any disinfectant in the cars before we went on back to the rest of Canada.
How were you treated on the trip by the residents along the way?
Oh, every town we went into, especially Newfoundland, they basically, when they got on board, they just took over. We didn't do, but we had to stay in hotels over there. We couldn't stay in the camper. Everybody was booked into a hotel. Best Westerns, there's 4 of them across.
But each person has to be responsible for his accommodation
Yeah.
and his day off or when
Oh,
he
yeah,
travels.
okay, and I'll come back to that. So here's the itinerary, you can look through that, and it was 34 days we were on the trip, going that way. So it was quite intensive. You can see the mileages on certain days or the hours, approximate hours, like 6.5 hours there, 6.5 hours there, 4 hours there, 3 hours here. So it was quite a demanding trip. And we were the slowest vehicle on the system with the truck speed of about 35 miles an hour with a camper on it, going across Canada. And we had a misfortune of, well, it was partly my fault, but I won't get into the mechanics of that, but we had to have springs re-arched in Edmonton. So I was able to get into the McCoy Spring Works. And they said, if you've been here last year, we had those in the stock, in the racks, but we got rid of them all. And they did stuff for Caterpillar tractors and things like that. So we had to take the camper off. I had 2 jacks on it. There's 2 front ones were on it up here, but the back ones I left home. So a day and a half later, we had a new, the springs re-arched. They broke a main leaf on one, and they had to make a new one, and we were on our way again in a day and a half. So then we had to catch up. So I think one day I drove from Edmonton almost to Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and I think we were on the road like 14 hours. It's quite a rough.
Who was all in the party in your truck?
Well, I had my wife and the 3 boys, Ryan, Ross, and Robin. And Ryan was like 13, 11, and 7.
They have found members of this tour that you
Oh,
know?
yeah. But they also often would ride with other people in some of the roadsters and other cars across Canada. So
some of the stops, while you're doing the stops, Alexander Graham Bell, what was that like?
okay, if you ever want somewhere, a museum to go to, and you've got a little bit of time because you have to do a lot of reading, like there's all charts and everything. Graham Bell Museum, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best museums in Canada. It's just great. It's in New Brunswick, or on the edge of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. And Graham Bell, of course, was the inventor of the telephone. But one of the things they did out in the ocean out there was run boats. He built hydrofoil boats that would do 16, 70 miles an hour in the 1910s and 15s. So he should have got hold of the BC government, tried to build hydrofoils here. They were using aircraft engines because he was involved with the Wright brothers and those people with the aircraft of the day. So that's another interesting museum is the Upper Canada Village, and that's just before you leave Ontario and go up towards Ottawa, the river, St. Lawrence River, and go up towards Ottawa. And Upper Canada Village is everything's pulled in there from all around, and it was at that time all 100 years old. Had to be, and there was all sorts of amazing things in there. It's a beautiful. And one of the interesting things, like on our trip, we had quite a few kids on the trip. We had seniors on the trip, and we had this one family that had the baby that went on the trip, and it was about a year old. So we get to Upper Canada Village for the tour, and it says family rate. So the guy says, well, how many kids you got? But I think we had about 15 or so. And he says, okay, we'll put those on. Who's the youngest here? Or who's got the youngest kid? So they paid, or they got all the kids in free. All the kids in free. So we con our kids going up and talk to them. Daddy, can I have an ice cream? And things like that. It was something exciting. Okay. Another museum we went to, which was our day, I should mention that every family that went on the trip had a day or so, and we being one of the latter people to get on the tour, we ended up taking people that had dropped out of the tour, and so we took 2 days. So we had Peterborough and Smith Falls and that area. So we went to Lang Museum, which is in Ontario, which all the buildings in there were 100 years old. And it was interesting, one of the buildings came from the little town of Minnie where my cousin's farm was, and that was the daughter of Brian Spencer, my dad's next brother up. And so we visited them there, and so at Lang, and they took us over to this museum, so we went there. That was our first day. The next day we went into Peterborough, and or that part of that day was Peterborough too, and they put on a big picnic for us for the group up in the park up in the hill. So we all went up to eat our supper up there. We came back, and most of the cars were in the hotel, or across the street in the hotel was a Ford dealership, and the Ford dealership put on a square dance that night. So the whole town was out, and there was square dancing going on. So that was, those kind of things would come up all the way across. But the interesting part, we get a letter when we get home from Peterborough, from the person that sort of helped arrange this from the car club there. He says, you know where you had that square dancing? He says, the day after you guys left, he said, what did you guys do? He said, the Ford owner was relieved of his dealership. But that's just some interesting little anecdotes that happened.
How did the RCMP help you out all across the way?
Oh, well, going back into Manitoba, we ran into a whole bunch of RCMP. We were scheduled to meet Terry Fox in Ontario, or in Manitoba. And the day before we were to meet him, the police said to come in and set up what we had to do and so on. And he packed it in. That was the day he quit. The cancer got too bad. So we missed the interview with Terry Fox and CBC. And
did the RCMP sort of direct you at not only that, but kind of lead you into towns?
Oh yeah,
as an escort?
All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had escort when we're coming into the St. John's, Newfoundland last day. We were, they told us we had to be there at 4. About 2:30 in the afternoon, we all had a lot of the cars. Well, by the end of the trip, everybody had bought one just about. Had walkie-talkies in the old days of walkie-talkies on what the trucks used to use. So our handle was AA Ford from the AA truck. AA Ford, and so they texted us out on the network because they were following us, all the cars, and said, you got to get down, you're going to be, as soon as you get here, we're all going to follow behind you. So we were the first in St. John's.
Okay, so when you also, you had quite an experience with the Hutterites too.
Oh yeah, in Poplar Point in Manitoba, the tour master, John McDonald, Gary's got one of his books that's got a lot of information on the trip. He taught in that area by York, not by Yorkton, not far from Brandon anyways. And so we went up to this Hutterite colony because he taught some of these kids somehow. I don't know how that happened in his younger days. But so we had a Hutterite meal. And one of the fellows in our group, he gave a couple of the kids money to look after the cars outside. And we went in. Of course, they don't have money. They don't have bank accounts. There's one bank account for the whole establishment. So we went and had lunch, and they had their own bologna from their own farm and stuff like that. So all the men down one side, all the girls down this side, all the way down to babies up to elderly people. That's the way they had their meals. So this truck, going back to the truck and the camper, sat in Gary's garage and shop for how long? A year?
Well, a year, I guess.
Maybe more. Yeah. And we just go out there, and when Gary'd finished jobs at work, at maybe 10 or 11 o'clock, we'd start working on that. I can remember leaving there at 2 in the morning, working on the truck. Now this truck, as I said, we're the third owners of it, and it didn't have many miles on it, but we had to totally restore it, paint it, and put a new engine in it and all that. But the driveline gears and everything were just mint with only 30,000 miles on them. So when we started building this camper, the winter, I started in the fall looking for windows. The windows, you see, are all square on the corners. About that time, campers were having the radius type of windows come in, so I had to go all over the place to find old ones that I could make fit and work where I had. But they're all safety glass windows and so on. And so that's the way the windows are. It's all cedar construction, and all this stuff is cedar. And it's,
It looks similar to Norrie's parents' camper in actuality. Sort of.
yeah, so we, right behind the cab here, I built that as a solid barrier up there with plywood. And so it's acted as a roll bar. If the truck had ever rolled somewhere, everybody should have been pretty safe. So we had a sort of built-in roll bar into it. And so there's us putting water on it here at Cattle Point, and somewhere else we put water on it at the other end of the country. So from the back we had 2 spare tires on it, and we had, in some places you'll see pictures of chairs on the back there. We had our deck chairs on the back there. So from the back it didn't look like a too old a camper, so people would come up and honk their horns. So that's the reason for the sign we put on the back there. There it is, it's right there. Bessie, the 31 Model A, passed with care.
An interesting thing about the cars that the Spencer family owned is they have names. Now, I was writing some stuff and I got writing Bessie, and Bessie, I'm trying to think, Bessie, what, you know, it sounds like an animal or something.
So that's the name of the truck.
Yeah, I asked him that question. I said, how did you get the name? Oh, it's one of my dad's cows when we first moved out to Sanders.
There was Princey, and then there was Bessie, and then that was, I can't remember.
All the cars have a name, and it's amazing how that is done. And I told my wife and my daughter that, and my wife smiled, and she said, well, your daughter with her new car is called Betty. So I go, wow, it hasn't stopped.
Okay.
It's quite common.
So yeah, we're talking about Gary. See those ribbons? Gary's wife made those for us here, and I took, I don't know how many, 500 of them? 1,000?
Lots.
Yeah, lots. We gave them out to all the kids on the tours. Kids that come up and see the cars, and so we gave them that. And another thing in Newfoundland, we came out of the hotel, and about 4 or 5 of the cars had all the valve caps taken off their tires. Some kids wanted those for a souvenir, I guess.
So quite sharp. How many in total were on in the tour, approximately?
Well, it's 24 or 25 cars, and the average probably was somewhere between 2 and 4, I guess.
Okay. You mentioned we got screeched in Newfoundland. I'd heard of that, but didn't know what he was talking about. So Norrie explained it to me.
Okay, Screech is, of course, their high-test rum. I don't know where it comes from, probably down in Barbados or somewhere, where they make all the rum. So yeah, we part of our induction into Newfoundland with all the government officials and so on. This was right by the university there, and so they made us eat this little piece of fish. Basically, you're told to swallow it, and then you take a little glass of Screech, down it down, and so they gave us a picture of. We had so many pictures. What we put on, we didn't put. They gave us a picture of the famous boat from that. Not Blue Nose, is it? Yeah, and a bottle of Screech. So because when we went back to North Sydney, we were to be shipped back home on the rail with all the other cars, except there was 4 or 5 didn't want to come back on. They wanted to go somewhere else, but we were too tall. They missed their calculations, or maybe it was part that when they measured the truck, it had the stake side on it. Didn't have that, so I don't know what happened. But we were too high to get through the first 2 overpasses where the rail had to go. So they said, you either got to take the camper off and pay for 2 spaces, or we can't take it. So we elected to drive home. So we ended up driving home, and we beat the train to Vancouver.
What happened when you went to get fuel at the gas stations with the traffic? With all the attraction, the people?
Oh, well, there's always people there. We took on, I was down in the bottom corner. Oh, you don't see that show anywhere here. Back corner of the truck on each side, I used to keep 2 jerry cans of fuel, because what we did was, because we were slow, we'd start at 6 in the morning. And by the time gas stations were open, it was 8 or 9 o'clock, so I can fuel up again. So I'd fill up and
Did you
run.
not cause a bit of a traffic jam at the service stations because people saw you there and everybody
No,
stopped?
well, people, anywhere you went, there was people coming, looking at you, and looking at the units over and the cars and everywhere you went. So it didn't matter where you went, but yeah. So I used to fill up gas and run, and by 8 or 9 o'clock there'd be gas stations open, so it was okay. But it burned quite a bit, you know, it was going across Saskatchewan east. I breezed across that on idle. Wind was behind us. Coming back home was the other way around. It was just the wind against us. In fact, I stopped because it was so windy driving into this wind. And then I pulled into a parking, a campground. And the guy came in next to me. He said, I had to get out of my crop flying plane. He was up flying. It was so windy. So he said, I can see why you had to come in here. Okay.
Can we ask you a little bit about the radio station in Newfoundland that really got on
Yeah,
board?
well, you know how they used to do Swift Shore here in Victoria? The radio station announced where all the boats were every hour. Well, they did that as we went through into Newfoundland, and all the time we were in Newfoundland. And we never bought a meal in Newfoundland. I think maybe breakfast the odd time at the hotel. But they always had big meals and all the fancy pies and stuff we ate when we were in Newfoundland. It's amazing.
Just with the radio station, Norrie, VOCM, it's a common name in Newfoundland, but they really broadcast you, and then you had, on your drive, the RCMP would say, okay, give them another report. When you got closer and closer, they sent their own people out to do all the work. You didn't have to do anything, they just kept. So all of Newfoundland knew these guys were there, by far.
We had to do a parade around St. John. And we were down the bottom up I think we drove one every second street in the whole town. So it was a two-hour tour just around the town.
So how was the ride over on the boat to Newfoundland?
It was great going over until we got to the dock, and there were so many people there that we couldn't get off right away. And then the guys looked at their watch. Oh, they're union, so when we've had our supper, we'll come and let the rest of you off. And so we were late for supper that day. We were scheduled to be in one of the air bases, U.S. air base at that end.
How did anybody get sick on the boat? Was it rough?
Well, not that trip. When we came back home on this boat, on the long trip, that's an overnighter from St. John. The other one's a shorter one. The wind was so bad out there that half the boat was seasick. And I went down to just check on the cars once down on the deck. All the cars were chained down to the decks. Because the whole boat was just bouncing around. That's an Atlantic coast, regular waves. This car here, the pickup truck, it's the Rosemead Farm sign. There's a picture of it here again, and here is again. We traded this Oldsmobile for that car, or for the pickup. Got the pickup, and it was all in pieces out of the Fraser, out of North Richmond. So this fellow sitting in there with me is the CEO of Ford of Canada. We were invited over to the 100th birthday party of Ford of Canada in 2003. And Clive Wright, and some of you might know Clive Wright here, is in the V8 Club. Clive and I went over there, and we got a picture of him. A guy came and he said, you can't go for a drive. We got to catch our plane to get back to Ontario. But he gave me one of the original books of the 100 years of Ford. And it's quite an interesting book and some other stuff. So that was back in 2003. Actually, Ford never wasn't in Canada until 2004 officially. It was 2003 in the States, but all the parties they picked about 10 cities around the world to have these parties. And we were able to get, well, they actually paid my ferry fare. And I got my check from Ford of USA for the ferries later on.
What was the first car you bought when you were getting into cars? What was the first one?
The first car was the 1942 Ford Coupe, sports coupe. And I had that in grade 11 and grade 12 at Royal Oak School. And that was bought from, is it Dick James?
Dick James, yeah.
From his dad was, at the time, pastor of the old Metropolitan United Church downtown. So that was my first car. I had that for, I don't know, well, Gary was one of his first paint jobs. He painted it white.
Right. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was in high school, so that would be 1956. Yep, and so that was my first car. And while I was still driving that, I came across this coupe. And I haven't got an original picture of it, have I? This is a coupe as I sold it. That was 31 coupe that came from Deep Cove, from Hartshorns. I don't know if you remember the Hartshorn people. They used to do logging and trees. In fact, I got one of the boys coming in the next few weeks to saw up some of my timber on the farm, and that's George Hartshorn. But I bought it from his dad, and so then I quickly put that thing together, and we put a light coat of paint on it, and then I drove it to UBC and then UVic for 2 years, and then we put it away in mothballs for a whole bunch of years, and I restored it again later. And then a guy came along and offered me too many dollars for it, and so I sold it. But this car was just about ready to go on the road, which I had bought 10 years previous. And I had that car for 50 years. Don had his for more, his Model A. And so it was 2007 when this went on the road, finished. And it took me 10 years to do this one, or 8 years to restore that and that came out of Atlanta, Georgia. I think we mentioned that last time.
Maybe some of the people that weren't here, maybe you could tell them a brief story. How did you end up getting that car, the prize car?
Yeah, well, it's a very rare kind of car, a cabriolet, and it's a very late 32 because it's got the 25 louvered hood and a few other changes. I had advertised in Hemmings for a cabriolet because my cousin Doan and a couple of his cars are over here, these T-Birds, and he has an iconic 32 Roadster that's in Peterson Museum today. And that was basically one of the first hot rods, of Deuce days. Okay, well, that was a Deuce. He started the Deuce concept back in 1938, 39. And so that goes back to Doan's results. Other people copied him. And so so that car, I got a phone call about this time of the year. I think it was first week, no, it must have been the end of February because we left on the 3rd of March. I was heading to a Model A meet in New Zealand, South Island, New Zealand. And we were going to tour New Zealand back in 1993 or 4, somewhere around there. Yeah, Gary's probably, I got the dates here too, just running by memory. So he phones me the next week, the Tuesday or Wednesday, I was heading to New Zealand. And I says, oh, and he told me all about it on the phone. He was phoning from Atlanta, Georgia. And so I said, okay, I'm interested. I'll get back to you this weekend, Saturday or Sunday. I'll go talk to my travel agent. And some of you people probably know Morris Kersey. He's passed away, but Morris Kersey with Kersey's Peanut Butter, he lived up the street from me at that time. And he had told him travel. So he made a quick arrangements for a trip to go to Atlanta, Georgia after I got back from New Zealand, 6 weeks in New Zealand. So that was early May, and I was able to visit my aunt, my mom's next sister up in Tennessee. And it was her husband that sent us the trains that we mentioned last time. So there's all these stories get interrelated to one another. So I said, okay, so I got back to him on the Saturday night or Sunday after Morris Kersey had arranged transportation for me by airline, and we were able to go through Memphis and get 2 days there and see my aunt, and then off to Atlanta, Georgia to look at the car. So I said, I'm sending you a $500 deposit by mail just to hold the car until I get back, because I realized you might need the money or something like that. And so he cashed the check anyways. And he said, if you hadn't have sent that check, I had 3 guys who wanted that car. And it was all in pieces. And that's a whole other story of putting the thing on Pat Hoole's trailer. What we got?
It seems all your cars are in pieces. People give
well,
up,
they
I
always
guess.
when I start that way.
Okay.
Generally. Okay, so Pat Hoole and I went back and got it. I think we talked a bit about this last time. And I brought that back, and by 2007, when I sold the little coupe, 31 Model A coupe, it was ready to put on the road. In 2009, the Victoria chapter, Vintage Car Club of Canada, had the May tour on Vancouver Island, and they were doing the judging out in Sydney there. And so I put it in for judging. Well, that car took all the awards pretty well it could get at that meet. And there's pictures of some of the trophies, so here they are right here. So it was best all-around pre-1948 vehicle, best highest point car pre-1948, and so on. So it's got quite a number of awards. And that car has since been in 3 concourses on the mainland. And I drove it to the first one, I trailered it to the other 2. We also trailered it to the 80th birthday of the 32 Ford Deuces in Peterson Museum in LA. And it was well received down there. And well, it was, the reason I was looking for a cabriolet with my cousin Doan, who had all the fancy cars in California. He said, the one car to get, if you can find one, is a cabriolet. Don't get the Roadster, get a cabriolet. Now, I don't know if some of you don't know the difference, but the cabriolet has roll-up windows on the side, not canvas. And the top all goes down and it drops into a hole. And it was Edsel's first job he got from his dad, Edsel Ford. And he was asked to design an all-weather convertible. And that was the one he came up with, that 32 Ford. And even up until the 40s and even 50s, the way the top material is held in place and the padding that goes up in here was the same all the way through into the 40s and 50s. Same procedures. Now they've changed things since then because of different materials and different systems. So that, we mentioned the other pickup truck that I traded from the Oldsmobile.
Yeah. What's it doing now? All right. What do you do with that?
Well, right now it's in the garage, up there, all in the garage. It had the farm sign on the side somewhere.
But it's still active still.
Oh, it's still got farm plates on it. So I burn purple gas still to this day.
You often see that pickup at the Saniston Fair.
Saniston Fair, the markets.
And markets.
So well, we haven't been to markets for a few years. But we still go to Saniston Fair. We're honorary members, my wife and I, of Saniston Fair. So we've done a few things different over the years. Okay, this map on the bottom is the blue is going and the red is coming back home of the tour. And we had the game in here last time, and here's a little picture of the game here. That was designed off that trip, and all the places are about 100K apart on the stops you make along the line. And so people have played that game different times.
Okay, again, thanks very much to Norrie Spencer and of course all his effort to get this put together. But I think all of you realize that the Spencer family, they've got an amazing head on their shoulders to do what they've been able to do. And Norrie's well into his 80s. Don is catching up.
He's in his 80s.
They're amazing. He still farms. I know he's getting tired, really tired. He thinks he should give up the farm, but I don't know. I don't think they will. But I hope you've enjoyed all this information. I hope it isn't overload for some of you. But again, thank you very much for coming out. All right, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.